So I'm Michaela Cheslov. I am the commercial horticulture specialist for CSU Extension in Boulder County.
And I am Abby Silver. I am the outreach coordinator for Boulder County's Wildfire Partners program. And we are here together to talk about using the Northern Water sustainable landscape templates that Northern Water developed after the Marshall Fire. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to be holding questions to the end. So if you have questions come up as we are going through our presentation, please just put them in the chat. And then once we get to the Q&A section, we'll go through and answer them. Please keep yourself muted if you don't mind, just because we don't want feedback or pets barking or whatever in the background. And I guess with that, we are going to get started and just quickly walk through what this presentation is going to be about. Oh. Well, we've already gotten to technical difficulties. Okay, here we are. So we're going to start with just a brief introduction to what CSU Extension is and what Wildfire Partners is. We are going to do a sort of quick dive into what is a wildfire, an overview of wildfire resilient landscaping best practices, followed by an overview of the wildfire resilient plants. And we will wrap up with a Q&A. So super briefly, Wildfire Partners is Boulder County's wildfire mitigation program. We've been around since 2014, and since the Marshall Fire have been focusing more services on the East County, which was not really part of our purview for the first 10 years or so of the program. And Michaela, tell us about CSU Extension.
Excellent. Yeah. So this is my spiel. CSU Extension is a non-discrimination equal access institution. So we do provide, we try to provide accommodations if you need those to access any of our programs. And CSU Extension, for folks who don't know, is the education and outreach arm of the university. So most folks know about us through things like the Master Gardener program or 4-H. And so we obviously have other programs like horticulture, family and consumer sciences, things like that. So, yep, that's us.
So just a quick word about the actual templates themselves. So they, and you will see a lot more about what's actually in them, but they were developed by Northern Water, which is this region's water authority, to help people who are rebuilding from the Marshall Fire meet the landscaping needs, especially as people often found that their financial resources for recovery weren't really matching up with what they were getting from their insurance providers and other agencies. So they were developed based on typical lots in the Marshall Fire rebuild area, but they are modular, so they're really available to anybody and everybody within the county and really up and down the Front Range to use either in totality or in part. And Michaela will get into that a little more when we get to that section. But just to start off, I think it's important to recognize what a wildfire is, because part of the point of Michaela and my role on the advisory committee for these templates when they were developed was to make sure that homes that are being rebuilt from the Marshall Fire are able to withstand, or better able to withstand, another fire if we do have one. So a wildfire is different from a house fire in that it is a fire that starts in the vegetative fuels, not like in the developed built environment. And under extreme weather conditions, these fires can spread very quickly to the point where resources get overwhelmed. So there aren't enough responders to go to each incident. And that's how you end up with catastrophic fire like the Marshall Fire that turned into an urban conflagration. So 90% of structure ignitions during a wildfire are caused by embers. These are little sparks and firebrands that can be blowing up to a mile or so ahead of the fire. And as you can see in this photo, that is basically, this is a photo of a air quotes home that was built in a laboratory and is being subjected to an ember storm that's being created in a laboratory. And you can see where the fire is starting is in the mulch, in the little shrubs that are planted right up next to the house. And this really underscores the importance of integrating fire mitigation into your landscaping choices. And here is a visual example of why this matters. So this is the home, pictures taken from a home that was involved in the Marshall Fire. It did not burn down, but what you can note is fire ignited probably in debris that was under this columnar juniper, and the fire spread up the tree through sort of along the roof line and went in through the gable vent on one side of the home and burned all the way through the house and came out the other side. And I think Michaela shared this series of photos with me and just a week or so ago, and this home is still under renovations 2+ years later. Just for those who are sort of paying attention and are like, why is that plant still green and not charred? I had that question myself and I don't know the answer to it, but I'm guessing this has to do with the intensity of the wind. So once the fuels were ignited, the fire was running up, and I'm guessing the backside of the tree that we can't really see is charred, but it really was just pushing the flames towards the house. I have another example of this same type of thing. So this is a home in the Coal Creek Ranch neighborhood, and during the Marshall Fire, this entire garage part of their house burned, and it charred some of the house itself. So this has all been remodeled since the Marshall Fire. But where this green triangle is, that the big red arrow is pointing to, was a small juniper. And that is what caught fire. And then the garage caught fire. And if there hadn't been fire responders there, the whole house would have burned down. But someone happened to drive by with a hose and be able to put this out. So this really underscores the importance of fire resilient landscaping best practices. And sort of the general concept level is the first 5 feet or so from your home out should be completely non-combustible. And then as you get further and further away from the house, your plants go from lower growing and more dispersed to where they can get taller and perhaps clustered a little bit closer together. In more of our urban, suburban development, we aren't going to get to that point like 30 to 100 feet away from the house like you do in the forest, where the trees can really start to be dense, because you're going to start impacting your neighbor's home. But this is just sort of the general concept level practice. And I'm just going to go through a few sort of quick visual examples of what fire resilient landscaping looks like. So you want to have an intermix of hardscape elements like boulders and rocks and gravel and concrete pathways and driveways with your plants. Michaela will go into the details of like the beauty and the colorfulness and all that part, which I personally highly encourage. But if you have some potentially taller growing things like some shrubs or some taller plants, you want to make sure that they're surrounded by lower growing plants and hardscape. And again, plant in small irregular clusters or islands so that if embers are blowing in and something does ignite, it's not going to, your landscaping doesn't create like a fuse that will lead that fire towards your home. Re-envision mulching. I think a lot of us think of mulch as like shredded wood or that type of material. And we think of piling it up in the plants that we traditionally have always placed right next to our home. The sort of fire resilient way is to use pea gravel or squeegee, which is a type of pea gravel that's specially designed to be more, have more water retention properties. And or you can just leave bare ground where in between plants. There's a variety of things besides plants that you can put near your home that are beautiful. And here's a few examples. There's yard art, sculpture, things that are, interesting looking boulders. If you want to have those flashes of color right next to your home, but you want to do it in a fire safe way, plant in non-combustible planters and pots so that if conditions indicate that it's not smart to have them right near your house, you can just move those entire pots away from the house. And I just love this example. Somebody just sort of used different colored stones to make a sculptural pattern in the space near their home instead of using plants. And then moving a little bit away from actually the landscaping, but sort of the landscape elements, fencing is a huge element. There's been a lot of conversation about that post-Marshall Fire. Wood fences can definitely act as a fuse that will draw fire from the landscape towards your house. And best practices would indicate using a non-combustible material for your fencing. That's obviously like metal, concrete, block, etc. And one other spot to pay close attention to right near your home is the window wells. So this should be an area that is protected, that's kept clean at all times, and ideally is constructed of a non-combustible material. And on the fence side, if you don't have the money to retrofit the entire length of your fence, you for certain want to make sure that the last bit, 8, 10 feet, 5 at the minimum, that abuts your home is a non-combustible material. And you can also break up the fence in other places, like if you put a metal gate sort of in the middle of the fence somewhere, like if you're trying to lead into the neighbor's property, like you like to go back and forth, or you can just put a non-combustible section somewhere. Think about how to strategically interrupt fire from being drawn straight to your home. If you're in the process of rebuilding or you're considering what to do about a deck that you already have, definitely a patio would be a much better alternative from a fire resiliency standpoint. I was told by the person who built this particular patio, which is in the Marshall Fire area, that it was the less expensive option versus a deck for them. So there's that. And it could be poured concrete or another hardscape material like flagstone or pavers. And then sort of finally, think strategically about the sort of other things that you might have in your yard and in your property. If you're putting a shed on your property, put a non-combustible perimeter around that shed. in the perimeter around your shed or your home, having the non-combustible perimeter is only as useful as how well it's maintained. So this isn't also the place to store your cardboard box recycling and gas cans, firewood, etc. So, and then I always encourage people as well to just think about what's next to your property when you're staging things. So if you're moving your own firewood away from your own house, but you're piling it next to your neighbor's RV in there where your driveways meet, that might not be the best strategic choice for them. So those are this is just an overview. And again, we're going to have time for question and answer at the end. But with that, I am turning this over to Michaela to talk to us about the templates.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abby. So tons of good information just in general about making sure your property is fire resilient. And so the sustainable landscape templates from Northern Water can be found on their website. And there are, as Abby mentioned, some designs based on the most common lot sizes of the houses that were affected by the fire. Next, please. I think the point here that we really would like to bring home for folks is that these really are just that, they're templates. So just depending on your lot, which way you face, your sun exposure, things like that, these aren't one size fits all, but they can easily be adapted. Next slide. So each template kind of has this general design. So it's just going to tell you, where hardscape features go, where they have low water use beds, things like that. But they won't have a specific plant list on this particular view. Next one. And then each design does come with this other view that does have a plant list. And I apologize, these things are tiny. And so when you go to the website and click on these designs, you can obviously zoom in so you can actually see what those plants are. Next slide. So this is just a little bit closer up. And so here's just kind of where I want to talk about how you might start adapting these based on your goals. And so obviously everyone's house is going to be pointed in a different direction. You might have different site conditions. For some reason, your soil may be a little bit different. Construction soils are notoriously different or difficult. So, just depending on what the lot was backfilled with, or if they scraped off all the soil, which is definitely something that is commonly done. So your soil conditions may be not as homogeneous as we would like. So everything's just going to kind of depend. And so we really want to just start asking questions about, most importantly, what are your goals, right? So what is the purpose of this space going to be? Just as an example, the plants that are listed here are all full sun plants. So if your backyard is facing north, they probably aren't going to be super happy there. And then, the cost of plant materials, the availability. So some of these plants may or may not be available. And then what the purpose is. So do you want to attract pollinators, things like that? Next slide. So our first step is just to do what we call a site analysis or a site inventory. And that is really just going to be looking at your lot and just noting every feature that could affect the landscape. So obviously you want to know which way your house is pointing, where you're getting sun throughout the day, whether you're facing west or north or whatever, obviously that sunlight is going to change throughout the day. You're going to want to pay attention to water movement. So maybe as spring's setting in and we get a couple more rain and snow events, you're just going to start paying attention to how the water moves through your landscape, where it pools, things like that. So you might have areas that have really bad drainage. And then you're going to pay attention to things like views. So if you're staring right at your neighbor, maybe you want to make note of that so you can construct some sort of screen. You want to note where your downspouts are. the wind direction. So obviously we know it comes, pretty much from the west. Any utilities, you want to definitely make sure you know where those are so you don't dig through them. And I say this from experience. And then any areas where you might have a microclimate. And so this might be a low spot in your yard where cold air collects, or you have a sloped area. So anything like that. And the best way to do this is just to observe and take notes. Next slide. So just kind of thinking back to that previous slide. So, if we just have a hypothetical example here with a north arrow drawn in, so that's the first thing you want to do. So we might have, that north side of the house, like I mentioned, might just be shady all day. Note where your drying west winds are coming in. Note where your views are that, maybe you want to put something really decorative outside the kitchen window. So when you're standing there doing dishes, you're looking at your beautiful garden. Again, noting those microclimates. Note where your very hot, dry exposures are. So the southwest side of the house is usually that. Again, just all of your downspouts, sloped areas, things like that. Next slide. And then obviously you just want to do what makes sense for you, right? So again, kind of thinking about that, like that back northwest corner. So maybe you want to put a shrub there just so you can screen a view. You want to add some screens just to kind of block some of those really, those really punishing winds when we have them. Looking out your kitchen window, maybe you want a pollinator garden. Also noting the elements that Abby was discussing. So in zone 1, you don't want to plant anything underneath your trees. You want to maybe have some of those decorative flower pots that are easily moved if we're having red flag conditions, things like that. Next one. So this is probably, if we're talking about gardening, this is like the #1 principle to remember. So right plant, right place. And this is just choosing plant material that matches your landscape conditions rather than the other way around. So we want to think about things like the purpose of your landscape, your goals as a gardener or a homeowner. And again, just those really common elements. And so the plant tags that come with your plants are your best friend. So these are going to tell you what your mature height and width are. So that's just going to tell you, you see folks who think that a cute little fuzzy blue spruce is kind of like a puppy, right? And so you just want that super duper close to your house until it grows into a 70-foot tree and it eats your driveway. See that all the time. So this is really just matching the plant to the existing conditions. So, you don't want to plant something like a rhododendron in Colorado because that plant is never going to be happy and you're constantly going to be fighting to create the ideal conditions for that plant. So we're talking about locally adapted material, natives, regionally adapted plants, or things that are just that will grow well in Colorado if they're not native. Next slide. All right. So again, we're just, we're talking about creating a sustainable landscape, and that's really the purpose of these templates. And so we create those sustainable landscapes by reducing inputs. So if you bring in plant material that matches your site, you don't have to water as much. You don't have to amend the soil as heavily. You don't have to bring in a bunch of extra inputs like fertilizers. You reduce the cost because you don't end up having to keep replacing plant material that's not happy in the landscape. It reduces maintenance costs, and in the long run, you're saving yourself some frustration. So if we just kind of take these two pictures as an example, the photo with the tree planted right up against the house is in my neighborhood. And this new baby tree is planted about 8 inches away from the house. And you can also see it's right next to the window well for their basement. And so very, very limited rooting space there. Obviously, that tree is going to grow right into the house at some point. Even if it's a small ornamental, it's far, far too close to the house. From a fire perspective, you obviously don't want that that vegetation that's just leading right up to your roof, right into your house. And then if we look at the other photo, You have Colorado adapted plants. These are xeric plants. The mulch is matched to the plant needs. And so a lot of xeric plants don't want wood mulch because it just holds a lot of moisture. And so we're just talking about matching, again, all of those site conditions to the plant material. Next slide. All right. And so again, Abby really covered all of these. So the biggest thing is we want to focus on keeping our plants happy and healthy, right? So plants that are happy, that are green, that are growing well, have a lot more moisture content in them. And so they're less, or they're more ignition resistant, I guess is the terminology we like to use. So if you have a plant that is struggling, that has a lot of dieback in it, obviously that plant material is going to be a little bit more flammable than if it's, nice and hydrated, healthy, growing well. And I'm going to skip over this stuff because you already covered it. And next slide. Excellent. So just some basics. So when we're siting trees and we're thinking about being more fire resilient, in zone 1, and actually I should say zone 2, so that ignore that typo. So we don't want to plant in zone 1. So zone 2, which is that 5 to 30 feet, you want at least 10 feet, and I would say even more, between the crowns of trees at mature size. So this is where the plant tag is your friend because it's going to tell you how tall and how wide that tree is going to be at maturity. So you just want to make sure that you're accounting for that mature size. And then at least 10 feet away from structures. So you can see in that photo where the evergreen is growing right into the house, that's obviously not what we want to see. There are also some foundation shrubs there, so we'd want those moved away from the house at least 10 feet, probably a little bit more if it's the evergreens. And then here's a good example of a tree that's planted in a front yard. It's a small ornamental tree, so it's an appropriate size for that landscape. It's not touching the house or the neighbor's house or anything like that, right? So we're just talking about, again, placing the right plant in the right place. And then again, we just want to maintain those trees for health, and then choose deciduous trees. So as Abby mentioned, some plant material is more flammable, and that tends to be things that are higher in resins and other flammable compounds, things that are drier, especially in the middle of summer. And so we want to choose trees that are more that hold more water. And so deciduous trees tend to kind of fit that bill. And then keeping stuff watered, of course, so it's happy and hydrated. Next slide. So when we're talking about shrubs, we just want to avoid planting shrubs under trees. So this is something that creates a situation where there are ladder fuels, right? And so as you're thinking about fire moving across the landscape, if you have a shrub under a tree and that shrub ignites, and then it sends flames up into the crown of the tree, and the fire crowns, and then you have a situation where embers are blowing out of that tree, the tree's on fire, bad. So we want to avoid planting under trees, or at least having appropriate spacing under trees. Again, planting in those islands, like Abby mentioned, separated with fuel breaks. And here's a good point to mention that well-watered turf is a fuel break. And so if you have watered, maintained turf that's mowed to an appropriate height, and it's green, then that's providing a fuel break. Don't place shrubs under windows or up against the house. So that's an example here in that left-hand photo where there's some foundation plantings. And this isn't to shame anyone. This is just what our landscapes were designed for, right? At some point, this was just really popular to have foundation plantings because they're beautiful. But as we're thinking about moving toward a better fire resilient landscape, then we don't want those foundation plantings. Okay, next. And then grasses. So we get a ton of questions about whether or not grasses are safe, especially ornamental grasses in a fire situation. And so again, just having those grasses, if they are close to a structure, mowing them to the appropriate height. I have 4 inches here, that's the recommendation, but it really depends on the species. So if you're trying to grow a low grow mix that has native grasses like blue grama does not love to be mowed. And so mowing can actually reduce the health of those plants. Again, they dry out because they're unhappy or dead. And so just having a low grow mix that isn't going to get much higher is also appropriate, and just leaving it unmowed. And then water in red flag or high fire danger conditions. So if you're trying to have a native lawn that's unwatered, which is something we're seeing more and more of, that's fine. But maybe you apply water if we're starting to see those conditions that are really dry and really windy. For tall grasses, again, those are totally appropriate to have in those planting islands. And so you can see here in the photo on the right, they have some ornamental grasses. They're kind of planted in a rock bed. I know it's a little bit hard to see. They're not touching the house. Ignore the foundation plantings in this photo. So we're just looking at those grasses. So totally appropriate, and totally appropriate to leave those standing through the winter because they do provide good habitat. And also they reseed. So the other things I want to point out here, this development did have native grass areas, and so they intentionally seeded these kind of rough areas with native species, and they were wondering if that was fine. But you can see where they have that grass mowed where it's close to structures. And so that's what we would like to see is, in those areas where we're looking at that zone 1, just keeping those grasses mowed, and then everything kind of outside of that is totally appropriate to leave it long. And then maintaining strategically, all I mean here is again, if we're having high fire conditions, then that might be a time to water and or mow those longer grasses just to kind of create that fire break between you and these more naturalized areas. But that doesn't mean you have to mow, everything way out into an open space, right? Just kind of creating that fire break, keeping that well watered. All right, next. Okay, so the most important thing, I would love to get into all the plants that you can plant because obviously I'm a plant nerd. But more importantly, just because these are templates and your situation is going to be different, I want to give you some resources. And so again, just kind of avoiding those across the board or uniform prescriptive recommendations and adapting to what your site is. So what works for you, and matching, following that right plant, right place, right? Matching the plants to your site and to your goals. So I'm a plonker. I'm just going to admit that. I actually have a colleague who gives a whole lecture called Plan, Don't Plonk. And so this is really just approaching landscape design with intention, right? And so just kind of thinking about, like Abby was saying, what those elements in your landscape are and designing for ignition resistance. Please do call our master gardeners. This is why they're there. They will give you all the plant recommendations. They love talking about plants. So their contact information is there. Next slide. The CSU Extension website has a ton of fact sheets and plant lists. So you would just go to that extension.colostate.edu site, click on publications at the top, and then scroll down until you get to natural resources. And there's a link there that'll have a bunch of native plant fact sheets if that's your jam. Wildfire and Forestry is another important site, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. And then, of course, Yard and Garden. And so you can see there's a little link called Flowers that will have all of our plant lists. Next slide. Okay, so this is one very important fact sheet that I would like to point out. So again, you're going to find this under that natural resources link where it says Wildfire and Forestry. Confusingly, this fact sheet in one view has a different name than it does when you click on the print view. I have no idea why this happened, but you're going to look for this fact sheet. The easiest way is to search for it by that 6.305 or just by typing low flammability into the search bar on the website. And you have to click the print view in order to see the plant list. So it's just the way it displays on the web. But you can see this plant list is extensive. It was developed with pollinators and natives primarily in mind, but there are some non-native plants listed further down. You just can't see on this view. But this will give you all that information. So it's water needs, it's sun and shade preferences, the mature height, the flower color, all of this different information that will help you customize those templates to your yard. Next slide. Okay, so this is just an example of, again, of what those fact sheets look like when you look for those specifics. So this one is just called native herbaceous perennials for Colorado. And again, you have all of this different information. Next slide. And then the other resource I would like to point you to is on that same website, and I don't even think you have to be on publications. I think if you just go to the extension website and look on the right-hand side, you'll see a list of our blogs. The CSU Horticulture or Cohorts blog is amazing. So it's all of our extension agents who are horticulture folks across the state, and they post on this blog quite frequently. It's actually moving to a new home, and so our posts have slowed down while they move that content over, but still posting probably a couple of times a month at least, and about anything and everything you can think of. Next slide. And then just some other resources. So of course, Northern Water, they actually have additional templates for things like your health strips. Plant Select has free design templates on their website. And of course, that's the planting program where they develop plants that are Colorado adapted. Most of them are xeric. Obviously, public gardens. So there are a series of Plant Select gardens throughout the state. We have one at the Boulder County office in Longmont. You're more than welcome to come check it out. Resource Central has some great resources, including webinars. High Plains Environmental Center, if you're up in northern Colorado, they're in Loveland, and they also have free classes. Colorado Native Plant Society. So this brochure on this page, that photo, is a publication that is available for free through their website, and it is an amazing publication. I actually have one here. Oh, you can't see that because my little thing's on. But anyway, I would recommend looking that up if you're into natives. It's great. Next slide. Okay, so that's us. So we just would like to open it up for questions. The easiest way to ask a question would be to just drop it in the chat, so everyone isn't talking over each other. And we have about 20 minutes, so please ask away.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna leave this up for another minute or two, and then I'm gonna take the screen share off so we can all see each other a little better. I just also want to say that if folks go to our wildfirepartners.org website, under resources, there are links to some of the resources that Mikayla was talking about, and plenty of other resources on wildfire mitigation, home hardening, defensible space, etc. And then if you want to, haven't found the Northern Water templates yet, they're on their website, northernwater.org/landscape-templates, and you can poke around and look at all of them. And if I get my act together, I can put all this into the chat as well after I figure out how to stop screen sharing. So
And Abby, I can start dropping stuff into the chat as well.
Okay. Somehow all these things sort of move on the screen. Let me know when you're ready for me to take it down, because I can't see the chat at this
Yeah,
point.
if you want to go ahead and stop sharing, and then I'll start dropping stuff in the chat as we answer questions.
So.
All right, so the first thing I'm dropping in the chat is those Northern Water templates. And then I will drop Wildfire Partners website.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet. And the other thing people can do if you don't want to type your question, you can go to the reactions at the bottom of your screen, which looks like a kind of happy face with a plus sign on it, and click on that and raise your hand, and then we can call on you and you can just ask your question out loud. And there is a question that just came in that said, can you share the slides and recording from this presentation? The answer is yes. They will be on the Superior, like the Town of Superior's YouTube channel, I think is where they're going to end up. I think they will also end up on the Wildfire Partners YouTube channel as well. I'm not entirely sure because I'm not the person recording this, exactly how long that's going to take, but I'm going to suggest in a week or two. So next question, is there guidance on fireproofing an existing wood deck? I guess I'll take that question since it seems a little more home hardening related. Yes, there is. So first of all, there's sort of a few different parts of that question. And if I don't address your specific question, you can unmute and ask me some more questions about it. But if the concern is with the boards on the deck, first of all, the more well-maintained your wood decking material is, the less combustible it is. And probably the number one thing to do to fireproof, so to speak, an existing deck is just to pay attention to what you have on the deck. So if there are combustible elements on there, like the duck bed, the outdoor carpet, the seat cushions, the decorative, can of whatever, fireworks or something that you might be keeping on your deck. I mean, and that's very important to look at and at least pay attention to. I mean, you don't want to not live your life, but you do want to think about when it's appropriate to move those items indoors and not have them sitting on the deck. The other thing is making sure that you don't have a lot of dried leaves or pine debris or dried grass or things like fine fuels sitting on your deck. And then keeping the deck boards refinished if they're wood. Better than wood is to substitute that for a composite material or even a non-combustible material like metal or tile or something. And underneath the deck is, honestly, that's probably where the most combustible debris tends to build up. So keeping that area super clean, not storing non-combustible items under there, because that ladder or those old bikes that you might have under there are going to end up trapping leaves and whatever else is flying around. So I think the best thing to sort of fireproof your deck is to, without rebuilding it from scratch using non-combustible materials, would just be to like keep it top of mind, keep looking at it and thinking about like what could catch fire here. So is that pretty well answered? I'm taking silence as a yes. And
I think they said thank you, so I think you're good.
Okay, good. So I guess an update on when those items are going to be available, when this recording is going to be coming very soon is the answer to that. So.
Do we have any other questions? Site-specific questions or questions about your yard, your situation?
I actually have a question that I will ask. I don't know if it's anyone else's question, but so when you are choosing plants, I mean, I loved your analogy about the little blue spruce puppy because it was, I mean, A, I've seen that a lot, and B, it just makes so much sense. But Is there a rule of thumb, and maybe it's different for like plants, like flowers versus shrubs versus trees, but like how big is like the baby going to get? Like when you plant things, how far apart do you want them to be? And then it can be a rule of thumb like 2 times or 3 times the size of the baby. Like how do you plan, Michaela?
Yeah. So again, like I was saying, the the mature size of the plant should be on that plant tag when you purchase it at the nursery. So, and I would also say I always take those with a grain of salt because it seems like they are often they end up larger than the plant says or the tag says. So, and that goes kind of for all the planting material. But yeah, really those planting tags are your best friend. I would also say just kind of driving around and looking at mature trees. And so I also have another photo I really wish I would have put in, but in our from our neighborhood where somebody planted about 7 blue spruce in their front yard, and right now they're probably 10 feet apart. And I'm looking out my back door right now at two that must be 70 feet tall. They're probably 30 feet across. So just even just driving around and looking at what is in the landscape and how big things get. It's also a good idea just to get an idea of what you like. So yeah. And Abby, if I could ask you a question, and it's a question I get a ton, um, is how high do I have to limb my trees up in order to make them fire safe?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of I think the common wisdom really comes from science that's been more studies that have happened in the forested landscape where, you have acres and acres of trees and people. So the conventional wisdom is you want to limb them up 6 to 10 feet, which is basically how far you can reach when you're holding a chainsaw over your head. But in the more like suburban, urban environment, it seems that that is actually not really very smart for a few reasons. The ones, and mostly because I think it's not very healthy for the tree. And it really turns that tree into like um, an umbrella or something, and where wind can actually come up underneath the tree and start moving the tree around, disturbing it. And the last thing you really want to do is like end up creating the conditions that cause your best favorite tree to fall onto your house or your neighbor's house or your car or something like that. So fire, like embers are not going to be able to fly through the air and ignite a tree by themselves. The way that this works is embers fly through the air and they ignite fine fuels that will catch from an ember. So what you really want to do is limb your tree up like at least 3 feet or so from the base. And this is for coniferous trees. Like deciduous trees don't have limbs growing right down to the ground anyway. And the idea being that you can get your rake underneath there, you can get your lawnmower underneath there, you can keep that area free of debris and free of tall grasses. So whatever it takes to achieve that, I think is should be sufficient. And you can just adapt as you need to, and you may have to go back and keep sort of snipping the bottom branches if they start drooping again too.
Yeah, and I love that answer. And I would say from a tree health perspective, starting to make those corrections as early as possible. So for instance, a spruce, the new growth every year, those are called candles. And when they're just little teeny tiny, you can just pluck them off. And that's going to stop, that's going to obviously limit the size of the tree because it's not expanding new candles, new branches. So pinching often is the way to go there. Does anyone else have any questions? Do you have another, Abby?
Oh yeah, I have plenty, and I think the one one that I think we didn't necessarily delve into as much as maybe we could have, has to do with like the Northern Water templates don't really emphasize native plants as much as, say, like when we go out into the community and talk to people about the resiliency of different types of plants. We always say the native ones are the most well adapted to our climate and the ones that nurture our pollinators and our flora and fauna. But in these templates, those aren't necessarily always the choices. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about why.
Yeah. So the templates were definitely designed for ease of use, right? And so these are templates where the plant material is easy to find. In most cases, I would say easy to grow. And so this really is something that was designed as an entry, I would say an entry level, but when you look at them, they can be pretty complex. But these are things that you should be able to find easily in garden centers. And I would say if you want to swap some of those plants out, looking at those fact sheets, and again, because they're going to tell you the exposure, so whether they want sun or shade, they're going to tell you the mature size, the bloom time, the bloom color. So if you want to swap a plant out, I would just look for something that has all of those characteristics, and just replace that. Again, matching it to the site conditions. Does that answer?
Yeah, that totally does.
Okay.
And I want to piggyback on that and say, we're about to launch probably a bit of a campaign to get people to, like, air quotes, junk your juniper, get rid of junipers, a lot of them. I mean, you can argue that they're sort of dated in an aesthetic sense, but they definitely are not a wise choice to have in our current climate conditions planted right next to structures. But one of the hesitations that I hear from many people is, well, this thing is taking up like a 10 by 10 foot section of my yard or my landscaping, and what am I going to do with that space? And this is where I really love the template model, which is like you can leaf through those templates and just find a section that sort of fits that size and pull it out of there and use that plant. What do they call it? Like a plant map or something? Is that what you call those?
Yeah, the site plan, or I mean, really, it's just your garden plan, right? So yeah, I would second that. And folks, that is another question I get a lot is what do I do? What do I use to replace a juniper? Because they do have a lot of landscape value. And I have to say, I'm a juniper fan. But they do have a lot of value, right? Like they provide screening, they're good ground covers, but we do have a lot of replacements. For screening, one I'm recommending a lot is if you can have a taller plant, things like mock orange Philadelphus, which have amazing flowers that smell like orange blossoms. They're drought tolerant. They're super, super hardy. Or something like our native or regionally native service berries, something like that. So there are some options out there. Yeah, once you pull your junipers out. So all is not lost.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing that I personally love is sculpture. You don't have to replace a plant with a plant necessarily. And and it doesn't have to be expensive and elaborate, but even a metal trellis section that is stuck somewhere, at an appropriate distance from your home, and maybe in the summer you're growing some kind of viney plant on it, but even in the winter you have the trellis there sort of blocking strategically like the view of the neighbor's RV or whatever it is that you aren't excited to see.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
well,
Excellent.
I'm going to put in just a very last minute last call in case anybody has a last minute burning question, but otherwise I think we're pretty much at time and want to let people get back to their workday or their lunch or whatever. Thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to the town of Superior for hosting this event. Hopefully it was helpful to somebody. Taylor, you are muted.
Of course, thank you so much for putting on this webinar. This is going to be super helpful for our community. I'm going to post it on a video library to come soon. Give me a couple weeks to do it. But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone who joined. Excellent. Well, have a great afternoon.
Yeah, bye everybody.